The conservative is a statesman who is enamored of existing evils. That is, of course, as distinguished from the liberal, who wishes to replace them with others.
What's that from, Tavo?
So that is the wonderful Ambrose Bierce, an American writer and journalist who wrote The Devil's Dictionary, and that was his take on conservatives versus liberals.
Bear with me, but I remember being very disappointed back when I was studying history at university. I went to this talk about indigenous thinkers from Latin America in the 19th century. And this is the age of liberals versus conservatives. And it was so disappointing because when I arrived, it was basically the story of, sure, people who were racially indigenous, but all of these folks had basically been kidnapped by friars and religious orders and been turned into very good, upstanding Europeans. And that's what I love about Mexico to an extent, but it's what makes understanding it so difficult. Because today what we're trying to do is we're trying to understand whether Mexico is left-wing or right-wing. And on the basis of this very clear-cut and pithy quote that you just read, well, you simply have to see who's looking backwards and who's looking forwards. But when you get to like this mixture of cultures and of approaches to government in Latin America and Mexico, you suddenly realize, well, what's backwards and what's forwards? Like even like the indigenous way of seeing things originally was circular. It's not about this progressive forward and this regressive backwards vision of time, which is very European. So what are we actually talking about? Who is looking forward and backward? And I think the most contradictory of all these folks is the man whose birthday we're celebrating these days, on the 21st of March. It's a national holiday in Mexico, and it's Benito Juárez, Mexico's first indigenous president from 1858 till 1872. And he is a perfect illustration of all these contradictions. He was Mexico's liberal president, indigenous, but in a way, at least from our perspective, and actually from their perspective back then as well, an incredibly conservative man.
Definitely. And I think Benito Juárez, as you say, is a wonderful example of these fully Europeanized, fully indigenous people that bring about huge contradictions. Benito Juárez only spoke Zapotec, an indigenous language from Oaxaca, until the age of 12. He wasn't a person who identified as indigenous. He could not have been more indigenous. He grew up in an indigenous town with indigenous family. He was 100% indigenous. And yet, he would be the biggest representative at an ideological and, most important, legal level of European liberal thinking in Mexico. Now, at the time, he was very much celebrated by other liberals, other nations of the Americas, which led him to be called the Benemérito de las Américas, the most deserving of praise of the Americas. But revisionist literature today looks at him from a very different angle. So the people from the past saw him because, spoiler alert, his view of the world won, at least at the time, saw him very much as a hero. But today, we begin to question that.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's start with Benito Juárez and then move through Mexican history to really answer the question of whether Mexico is a left-wing country, as people believe it is now because of the current government, or if it is a deeply conservative country in truth.
Let's begin our story not in Mexico, actually, but in modern-day Italy, not far from the city of Trieste. In a castle overlooking the sea, the Archduke Maximilian of the House of Habsburg is penning a letter in which he is outlining 2 conditions under which he will accept the Mexican crown that has just been offered to him. What's really interesting is that one of these conditions, ironically, is that he's demanding that the conservatives who have offered him this crown prove to him that the people want him as their leader. So this is a monarch who wants to be acclaimed by the people, which is a kind of confusing departure point.
Yes, absolutely. But of course, we begin with contradiction and confusion because that's the history of Mexico. Just as a quick primer, even though I think it's pretty obvious at this point, Mexico after independence is roiled in violence, and the main representatives of this violence are the liberals and the conservatives. They're 2 political ideologies and they're 2 political parties literally fighting for control of Mexico's future. The liberals, more or less at this time, in the 1860s, have practically won the war. And so the conservatives have opted for the nuclear option, which is reach out to Europe directly and say, please intervene militarily, beat the liberals, and put a monarch atop the Mexican state.
Yeah, the conservatives are not very good losers. They've been soundly beaten in battle after a 3-year war. They're done. There's a liberal government in Mexico that functions, and they say absolutely not. So they get on a boat and they get themselves over to Europe, and they do a tour of the courts of Europe, looking for a suitable monarch who can take the Mexican crown. And Maximilian eventually does take the Mexican crown. He accepts, he jumps in a ship with his wife, Charlotte of Belgium, and they make their way over to Mexico. Now, poor Maximilian is under the impression that the Mexican people really want him there. He's going to show up and there will be crowds awaiting and he will be hailed as a hero. What he doesn't know very well, clearly, is that that is not the case. The liberals might not have full support, but they have substantial support. And there is, as I said, a functioning government in Mexico City led by Benito Juárez, who we've already spoken about. Now, who was Benito Juárez? We've said he was an indigenous man. Alex, you said he was the first indigenous president. Mexico had had presidents with indigenous heritage in the past, but never a president that was 100% indigenous.
And again, important to outline that this is a cultural as well as a racial category, as opposed to in the United States, where it's all about like the one drop rule of like racial like purity. Mexico's different. It's a far more mixed culture where to this day, the way you identify as indigenous isn't because of your race. It's about your culture and whether you identify as a person from that community. And
I think that's something particularly interesting. Because where does this come from? Why is it that way in the US? Why is it that way in Mexico? Well, in Mexico, there's very much an inheritance from the era of the Spanish crown. Now, we don't want to get into the weeds of pre-modern history in Mexico, but it is important to note that one of the things that happened while Spain ruled supreme in what is modern-day Mexico, the indigenous peoples were allowed to have their own communities with their own set of laws, with their own way of governing themselves in a very pre-modern way. What does that mean? In the way things were done in the past, it would have been done that way in the Mughal Empire, in the Egyptian Empire, in the Mongolian Empire, in the Ottoman Empire. It wasn't a world in which everyone was equal before the law and everyone could expect the exact same conditions. It was a world where certain communities had certain rights, other communities had others, and they were inherited through time and they changed through time.
And that was a good thing, right? Like the communities get to keep their culture. They get to keep the way they do things. And the Spaniards live in their own towns. The indigenous people live in their own towns. They don't mix too much, except for sort of like these middling people who slowly combine the communities. But really, the indigenous folks get to keep their ways. They get to keep their ways of government not intact, but at least to a certain extent recognized legally by the Spanish state.
Now, it wasn't all fine and dandy all the time. There were, of course, abuses, as there were in all great empires, and the indigenous people were not at the top of the food chain by any means, but there were many benefits to this system. Now, that was under Spanish rule. But now we are in the 1860s. Spanish rule has been over for 40 years. And we are, Mexico, creating a new nation in a new world. And Benito Juárez is very much, despite being an indigenous man, a representative of that new world. And I think there's a quote from him that really encapsulates his way of thinking and talks about the way things were done in Mexico for a very long time. He said, "Men are nothing, principles are everything." And that's how he did politics. He had a view of the world and he was happy to reform away, very much destroying things from the past to bring us all into a new world.
It sounds a lot like that quote you started with, the Ambrose Bierce quote about these lofty ideals to replace old evils with.
Definitely. And I think a wonderful example of that is the Ley Lerdo. It's one of these, Lerdo after a man whose surname was Lerdo. It was a law that the liberals bring into effect. And one of the things that it did was they did away with the communal indigenous land holdings. It was this idea that it's not about an organic society, that it's all connected in these non-linear ways. It's about we're all individuals, we all are the same before the law, and that's all very good, right? Well, hold your liberal horses, because by virtue of doing that, as we have said, he was destroying an entire way of life. Hundreds of years, 300 years, 350 years actually, of this way of life. And in his head, of course, as an indigenous man who was very successful in this new world, what he was doing, he was helping the indigenous people be part of this new world. But what he didn't see was that maybe not everyone wanted the new world, and he was still doing away with the systems that protect them.
And it's very different from the liberal that we think of today, because liberal nowadays looks to recognize these differences amongst people to preserve people without becoming homogenous, right? Like you want to preserve the way African communities do stuff in Mexico, the way indigenous communities do stuff in Mexico. That's literally now part of the Mexican Constitution as of this government, which is a law that says you communities, both Afro-Mexican and indigenous communities, are legally recognized as different and unique. This is a left-wing proposition, but back then, the left-wing quote-unquote proposition, the liberals' policy was we need to do away with these archaic ways of doing things, both on the Spanish side, we want to destroy the power of the church, but also on the indigenous side, let's destroy the way these folks govern themselves and make one nation united under the same laws for the same individuals. This individualism of liberalism, which today is seen as relatively right-wing, back then was pretty revolutionary. It was no longer the corporate forces. It is now the individual who reigns supreme.
As you say, today it is the super left-wing government, or allegedly super left-wing government, that's doing this. But who was trying to fight for this in the 1860s? Maximilian I of Mexico, the baby brother of Franz Joseph of Austria, a monarch from the oldest and greatest of the great monarchic families of Europe. He comes in and he says, absolutely not. We must protect the indigenous people. He makes efforts to learn Nahuatl and Zapotec. He tours the country meeting indigenous people because he says we must protect these things.
Can I just a quick bit of trivia here? Maximilian of Habsburg is the only Mexican leader to have ever given a speech in a native language. It wasn't Benito Juárez. It was the European imposter that came to Mexico and wanted to integrate into the community.
That's just fantastic, particularly because Benito Juárez was a native speaker of Zapotec. Benito Juárez did do a lot of things for the indigenous people. Like he made efforts to have official documents published in Nahuatl, which was not the only indigenous language, but sort of the lingua franca, let's say, of the indigenous peoples, or as close to as you could have to something of the sort. But it's Maximilian who really tries to protect their way of life. Now, as I said, spoiler before, Maximilian doesn't win. Maximilian ends up in the state of Querétaro, surrounded and alone, and is eventually executed by the Mexican military. Benito Juárez's view of the world, and Benito Juárez and the Liberal Party get to shape Mexico from that point forward. Basically, from the 1860s, it is the liberals who rule supreme. They dramatically reform everything about the country. They dramatically reshape the country. And with, at least ideologically, the best of intentions, they nonetheless manage to create a system that is deeply unjust. Porfirio Díaz, we've spoken about him in the past, he rules for 30 years as a dictator, and he is ultimately overthrown by a revolution led by the people that at one point Benito Juárez reform was allegedly trying to protect.
Now, we're going to skip the revolution because we don't want to go the same bits of history over and over again. We want to skip it, but we want to make it clear that Porfirio Díaz was a weird political animal. He was overall a pragmatist who put himself at the top of the political pyramid in Mexico, and he combined these warring factions under him, the liberals and the conservatives. Though he enters as a liberal, he emerges as a man who's combined these two forces, which means that liberalism and conservatism are no longer the defining battle in Mexican society by the time the revolution starts in 1910. It is more about the new ideas, the ones that see liberalism as practically as conservative as conservatism. And it's this new idea that permeates Mexico in the early 20th century that creates what I would call Mexico's first great post-revolutionary culture war. Lázaro Cárdenas was president from between 1934 and 1940. And his Secretary of Education, Narciso Bassols, was probably the most unpopular man in Mexico at the time. Now, if you read history books about the period, you usually get this talk about how Mexico was a deeply, deeply Catholic society that really, really, really didn't want to move away from its traditions. And yet, in the same book, you'll find people saying Mexico's full of these people who are desperate to be raised from poverty and empowered by a government far more radical than anything else, right? It's a revolutionary government. And what's interesting is what side the government picks will ultimately define who the opposition will be. And the side that they pick is the side of revolution, obviously, right? You get this new corporate system very much based, I'd say, on what we've been seeing in fascist countries, especially Italy, where the corporate system, more than being a right or a left-wing proposition, what it says is the government is the mediator between the different classes that exist in a country: the working class, the peasantry, the urban middle class, and the capitalists. And so we're going to unite them all into organizations, and they will negotiate under the onus of a benevolent state. Of course, Lázaro Cárdenas was very much from the beginning on the side of the workers and the peasants. The National Labor Law of 1929 really upset the business people, especially in the north of Mexico, who started to work together because they realized that basically you couldn't fire anyone after you hired them. It was pretty impossible to be a capitalist in revolutionary Mexico. But what really upset people was the inclusion in the Constitution of obligatory socialist education. And that's it, right? We've got it. It's come out. Socialism is now a big part of the Mexican political debate. Liberalism is old hat. It's conservative. Socialism is the future. And so we've got this massive culture war brewing. What does socialist education mean? It means actually pretty basic stuff to us nowadays. It means some measure of sex ed, secular education, and it's all pretty standard, right? Well, no. Created some of the greatest mobilizations against the government that we've ever seen, basically. What we talk about when we talk about the Mexican revolutionary government is this government that was pretty overwhelming against all oppositions. They always won the elections. They created the PRI, which is the party that was in government until the year 2000. And yet, these mobilizations were so important. They weren't armed because the Catholics had been defeated in the field of battle during a previous war called the Cristero War. So they came out accepting a very basic tenet of the new system, which is we're going to come together and we're going to work as a corporate unit. What do I mean by corporate? We're going to call ourselves what we are in the Mexican class system. And there's some wonderful names here that come up. You've got these folks coming out against the socialist education provision, the National Union of Parents, the Female Catholic Mexican Union, and the Union for the Middle Classes. They're very much working on Lázaro Cárdenas' terms to oppose him.
Now, what's really interesting to me is Mexico just went through a 10-year-long revolution that was unequivocally socialist in spirit. There were some really extraordinary, radical experimentations that happened during the revolution and the years that follow it. But somehow these conservative forces are so very much alive and so very much able to deter the government from, or at least oppose the government openly, from taking a left-wing position.
I'd like to sort of jump in there because let's not get into this rabbit hole, because basically this is the rabbit hole, the can of worms we've opened with this podcast, which is I disagree that it was inherently socialist. There were socialist elements, funnily enough, very openly socialist elements. And towards the end, maybe, you do get Álvaro Obregón, who becomes president, and he's the most openly socialist. But the one wonderful thing about the Mexican Revolution is everyone wants change and no one knows what sort of change they want. And so we've discussed this in a previous episode about the different sorts of revolutionaries. But you've got Villismo in the north, which is very state-oriented. And then you've got Zapatismo, which is, I think, illustrates the contradictions that we discussed above with indigenous communities in this liberal conservative paradigm, which is Zapatistas, these indigenous folks just south of Mexico City who rise up in defense of their land, are almost reactionary to a certain extent. They're revolutionary. They want equality to a certain extent. They want to come out of poverty and stop being repressed by the government, but they don't want socialism. They want to return to what they had before. Land is for the people who work it, which sounds very, very socialist, until you understand the sort of way they want to structure that land, which is community-oriented, but on the basis of communities of historical value rather than communities of class-based value.
And that's what's really tricky about the question, is Mexico left-wing or right-wing? Because what being left-wing or right-wing has dramatically changed over time. So, of course, when we hear about land belongs to those who work it, that smacks of Marx. But when you look at the Zapatistas and you see the logic that they were voicing, it sounds prehistoric, right? Or quite prehistoric, but definitely very old.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's get back to this culture war under Cárdenas. So you've got the streets filled with these middle-class people who never really protested, the people who hid in their houses during the revolution. They're out in the streets now. They're angry at this socialist government. And what I think is fascinating is the government, authoritarian, pretty much in complete control of the armed forces, with lots of support from the working classes in the cities and in the countryside. The government gives in. Because they fought fire with fire, these organizations from the middle classes and from the right are able to get Education Secretary Narciso Bassols to resign within 2 years of Cárdenas's government. And to a certain extent, Cárdenas also bows to business people.
What's crazy to me there is this is the same presidency in which the oil companies, oil in the country is nationalized. And we have footage of hordes of people coming out and giving the family jewels to the government so that the government could pay off the nationalization to foreign companies. So these two, with a 2-year difference, these two things coexist in Mexico at the same time.
Absolutely. We're starting to see the creation of a new system that can't really be defined by left or right, but rather by a sort of pragmatism where the government is all-powerful to the extent that the parts that make up the Mexican state allow the government to be. So the best example under Cárdenas is the election of 1914. He had his man in the race, which was Francisco José Mujica Velázquez, the Secretary of Communications and Public Infrastructure, who was a hardcore leftist. This man was Marx embodied. He was coming out and performing socialist policy on the ground in Mexico. That was the man that Cárdenas wanted to win the election. I mean, he had, in theory, right, the power to put him on the ballot and mobilize his forces, all the peasants, all the workers, all the etc. He could have won.
And mind you, there have been very few presidents in the 20th century in Mexico that were quite as powerful as Lázaro Cárdenas. Lázaro Cárdenas had a colossal amount of support from the masses of Mexico, and he had a colossal amount of support within the party. And yet
he steps back, and in his place comes probably the least charismatic person you'll ever meet, Manuel Ávila Camacho. Go on, Tavo. What do you call him?
El bistec con ojos.
That was what people called him. He was a beefsteak with eyes. He was a flabby, large man with very little charisma. But what he was crucial, which was he was a man who was clearly further right than even Cárdenas. He was a conciliatory olive branch to the business class, to the conservatives in Mexico, where the government, the revolution said, don't worry, we're not going to trample everything. You let us be, you let us stay in power, and we will negotiate with you. And that is more or less what we get for the rest of the 20th century.
So, question, Alex, to what degree is this acquiescence to the business classes and the middle class versus acquiescence to pressure from the US?
Well, we can't ever untangle these things because a lot of this is hush-hush. The interventions of the US, military interventions, troops landing on the ground in Veracruz were pretty fresh in people's minds. And of course, having a literal socialist government right next door to you is kind of awkward. They'd nationalized American companies during the expropriation under Cárdenas. But of course, look at the date here. It's 1940. What's happening in the world at this moment? It's the Second World War. America is a year away from joining it, but President Roosevelt is very keen to join from before, according to pretty much everyone. And so they had a policy in the United States, which was the good neighbor policy, which was, please don't make too much of a ruckus, and we'll just let you govern yourselves. And the Mexican government, again, just as they'd negotiated with the business class, also understands that this is a good opportunity to mend fences with their incredibly powerful northern neighbor. And so how can we untangle whether it was business or whether it was the United States? To a certain extent, the olive branch that is Manuel Ávila Camacho is on offer to all of these sectors, right? And that's why left and right is useful to an extent, because it's an olive branch to the right generally. And who are the right? Well, it's the capitalists, it's the conservatives, it's the Catholic Church, it's the middle classes who feel they want to use their individualist powers to get ahead in life, which used to be a liberal position, by the way, and is now a conservative position. And so there we are. We've got that. We've got this new system of conciliation under an authoritarian regime for the next 70 years, basically. And so we'll skip ahead across the various trials and tribulations of Mexico and how this system came under strain, the corporatist PRI system. And we arrive, I'd say, at modern Mexico. Listen to our last episode where we talked about the rise of Andrés Manuel López Obrador, Mexico's president from 2018 till 2024, because that more or less explains how that system came apart. And now we're in the new world, a new world where we've got what used to be to many people in the metrics that we have, still is, a very conservative country. Still very Catholic, very sort of weird if you compare it to Central America and Brazil, where evangelical Christians have risen. We've still got big Catholic folk here. So we've got a deeply conservative country on paper. And yet, it's a country that has overwhelmingly voted for an openly left-wing government, at least, again, on paper, right? But scratched slightly below the surface, and you start to see that this big left-wing party, Morena, the one created by López Obrador, now inherited by Claudia Sheinbaum, Mexico's president, it's actually got a lot of very conservative elements to keep people from rebelling. The most important one, I'd say, revolves around abortion. About 60% of Mexicans oppose abortion, and yet you've got a left-wing progressive party that, in theory, is pro-abortion. How do you conciliate that? Well, you hearken back to Benito Juárez, who was very keen in the federalist system. That was a big liberal policy versus the centralism of the conservatives. And the federal system says states' rights. And so every time López Obrador was asked, are you for abortion, something that could have tanked his approval ratings, he'd say states' rights. And when you looked at the states, and you looked at Morena, where they controlled many of the states, they would vote against abortion. Very conservative, because they're playing this game, I'd say, where they're trying to get their key policies, and I'd say the left-wing elements of Morena are very much a statist approach to the economy and a liberal approach, or a states' rights approach, a Benito Juárez approach, to social war issues that might divide the party and the country internally.
I think part of that is driven by the fact that Mexico is very divided depending on where you are, right? Or based on where you are. Mexico City and many of the big cities tend to be quite left-wing, quite progressive, even within the more conservative parts of those places. So in Mexico City, you're going to have a hard time finding a lot of people who are vociferously against, for example, gay marriage. They might not support it, but they won't be out in the streets. But if you go to, say, Ciudad del Carmen, to the distant oil town, you will find people who are otherwise lovely people, but they'll just go on diatribes about gay rights, about abortion, and how we're ruining principles and traditions under which we should govern ourselves. And being able to become president and remain president in a country that is so different depending on where you are requires this sort of dance between saying one thing and doing another thing so that you don't upset everyone around you.
Yes, and it's a dance that López Obrador did very well, arguably because he was, in many ways, a conservative. Claudia Sheinbaum is a different politician altogether. She is very much a person from Mexico City, from these intellectual elites that are pretty much categorically, pretty unequivocally left-wing. And she is a feminist. She is very much for state intervention. She's got an interesting industrial policy that she's now unrolling. And that could cause problems within her party and within Mexico. And yet, thank God for Donald Trump, she must be saying, because she has the highest approval rating of any Mexican president in living memory. She's got 85% approval from virtually all Mexicans because of the way mostly that she's dealt with a very clearly right-wing nationalist Donald Trump. And suddenly, to be left-wing isn't to be pro-abortion or something like that. It's to be the opposite of the boogeyman, to be the opposite of Donald Trump.
And to be fair, she has done a masterful job of dealing with Donald Trump, particularly as compared to what to me seems like a tantrum on the side of the Canadians in this great debacle that has been the tariff war.
I think we need to have an episode about how Mexico knows how to wrangle the US, because I think historically and currently, Mexico is so good. And it doesn't matter the party you're in, Mexico is so good at dealing with the United States. Actually, talking of the United States, I think there's an interesting case study where we can think about Mexicans more generally as a group rather than the nation and the space that is Mexico, talking about Mexicans, specifically what people think of as left-leaning, traditionally Democrat voting Mexican-American voters, because I think we've got a really interesting case study here, which is the swing towards Trump. I'm thinking specifically not of this election, but the past election. Zapata County in southern Texas is both one of the most Mexican districts in the US, and it's also one of the districts that had the biggest swings toward Trump between 2016 and 2020. And that's Trump, a swing towards Trump by 40%. An enormous swing. And it's very clearly, to a great extent at least, about the checks that Trump gave out and had his signature on it during the pandemic. I think it explains a lot of things about what Mexicans broadly believe as a unit, because we're a very, very, very diverse country. And yet there are a few things that I think people like. In an unequal society like Zapata County and like Mexico as a whole, there is...
Tortillas.
Yes, exactly right. But are they maize or are they harina?
That's the real question.
No, it's a historical suspicion, I'd say, and yet dependence on government, as opposed to these individualistic pioneers that go out in the American psyche and sort of they have to deal with government, but they'd rather not. Mexicans historically have a very convoluted relationship with government. They're suspicious of it, they think it's corrupt, and yet they're very dependent on it. And so when the government gets out of your way and then just gives you money, that is probably the best of all cases. And what's interesting to me is that's what you got with López Obrador and Claudia Sheinbaum, and it's also what you got with Donald Trump. And maybe even, we don't know if this will happen, but there's suggestions from Elon Musk in the Department of Government Efficiency that when they've saved billions of dollars, we'll see if they do, they will give out $5,000 to every single American. And that is, interestingly, something called socialist libertarianism. In the Mexico Political Economist, and you don't even need a subscription to read this one, I wrote a piece called Are Mexicans Progressive Now? That's a question. And it more or less approaches this like from this perspective. And the conclusion is that there's this obscure political economist called Philippe Van Parijs. He's a Belgian political economist. And he supported this idea of socialist libertarianism, almost an oxymoron. And what he says is, you have unconditional support for a minimum income and a light touch state in every other aspect. So you just get a lump sum once in your life, or you get like a wage that just comes into your bank account, and the state does nothing else. So maybe, ultimately, Mexicans aren't left-wing or right-wing, they're socialist libertarians at heart.
That very well may be the case. Now that sounds a little bit dangerous to me, because as you say, it's demanding that the state give you stuff, but then there can't be any conditions on it. And that, to me, sounds like a spoiled child. And that is not the basis on which, at least in my perspective, you build a society in which you have bonds of unity between people, which is ideally how a country should function.
Ultimately, I think you might be right, at least in terms of whether or not there will continue to be a debate around this. We started this podcast talking about whether or not Mexico was right-wing or left-wing, and we've ended the podcast not knowing the answer. But I think that's kind of the point. Let's not talk about socialist libertarianism. Let's continue talking about what we spoke about at the beginning, which is liberals versus conservatives. This is a 200-year-old bit of Mexico's history, and yet it's still an ongoing battle within the Mexican political discourse today. The reason we haven't seen former President López Obrador, who left government and left the reins to Claudia Sheinbaum, is because he is in Chiapas as we speak, tucked away from the public eye, writing a book about liberals and conservatives in the 19th century. That is what he's dedicating his retirement from politics. Because he's not really retired, is he? He's writing the new vision that he wants to project about the good liberals versus the bad conservatives, but there will be very much the liberals seen from his perspective, who might actually be slightly conservative from our perspective. And so the battle rages, and we'll continue to talk about it as it unfolds. But for now,
I'm Tavo Figueroa.
And I'm Alex Gonzalez Ormerod.
And this is Mexico, the podcast.
Every 2 weeks, we talk about Mexico, its history, economy, politics.
And why you, wherever you are in the world, are deeply affected by it every single day.
Despite that free article, the best way to support this podcast is to subscribe to the Mexico Political Economist. And there's a reason influencers won't shut up about this, because it really works. If you're listening on Spotify or Apple Podcasts, subscribe, give us a like, comment, and share with your friends, loved ones, and if you didn't like it, your enemies. But share. See you next time.